What does it mean when a ship survives but the people do not? Across the history of seafaring, there is a particular kind of mystery that resists easy telling. A vessel is found adrift. The hull is sound. The provisions are still there. A cup sits where a hand last placed it. A chart remains open beneath a weight of salt and wind. And yet the living presence that gave the ship meaning is gone, as if the sea had reached aboard and taken only the human story. We tend to imagine the ocean as violent when it wants to be feared. We picture storms, broken masts, waves rising like walls. But some of the most haunting episodes in maritime history are quiet. No wreckage, no clear distress, no final witness. Just working boats or seaworthy ships moving through empty water, carrying the shape of ordinary life after ordinary life has vanished. That is why these stories endure. They do not belong only to sailors or historians. They belong to anyone who has stood at the edge of what cannot be fully explained. In each case, the details feel almost intimate. A meal interrupted, a logbook abandoned, personal belongings left behind as though their owners meant to return in a matter of minutes. The facts are often sparse, but the silence around them is enormous. This is not a journey into superstition, nor a search for grand declarations. It is something quieter and perhaps more unsettling than that. It is an attempt to sit with absence, to look carefully at 10 ships discovered without their crews, and to ask what they reveal about fear, judgment, isolation, and the limits of certainty. Because sometimes the deepest mysteries are not about what was found. They are about what was left behind, still waiting, in the cold and patient light of the open sea. What could frighten seasoned sailors so deeply that they would leave a ship still capable of carrying them home? In December 1872, another vessel came upon a brigantine drifting east of the Azores, moving with the slow dignity of something not yet broken. Her name was Mary Celeste. From a distance, she looked alive enough. Sails partly raised, hull upright, course unfinished. But when men climbed aboard, they stepped into a silence so complete it must have felt almost staged. Inside, the clues were ordinary in the most unsettling way. Food and water remained. Personal belongings had not been looted. Cups, tools, and small domestic objects still occupied their places, as if the life of the ship had only paused for an hour. Yet the people were gone. The captain was gone. His wife and young daughter were gone. The crew was gone. One boat was missing, along with some instruments needed to navigate. Everything else seemed to wait patiently for hands that would never return. That is what made the case endure. This was not a ship shattered by weather or violence. It was a vessel suspended between abandonment and order. A few damaged barrels of industrial alcohol hinted at danger. Perhaps vapors gathered below deck. Perhaps a sound in the hold, or a fear of explosion, drove everyone into the lifeboat for what they believed would be a temporary measure. That remains one of the more grounded possibilities. And yet even that explanation leaves a human ache at the center of it. Why did they not make it back? What broke the line between caution and catastrophe? Over time, the Mary Celeste drifted out of maritime record and into legend. Writers embellished it. Rumor fed on it. But the real story needs little decoration. A capable ship crossed the Atlantic carrying evidence not of destruction, but of interruption. And maybe that is why it still speaks to us. Not because it proves anything supernatural, but because it reveals how quickly confidence can become uncertainty. A voyage can be measured, provisioned, and expertly led, and still one sudden decision may open a door that cannot be closed. The sea does not always defeat us with force. Sometimes it only asks us to choose under pressure, in incomplete light, with no promise that reason will be enough. How does an ordinary voyage become a question that outlives everyone on board? In the South Pacific, where distances can feel both serene and merciless, the motor vessel Joyita set out in October 1955 on what should have been a routine passage. She was not crossing the world or chasing fame. She was carrying people, cargo, medicine, and the quiet expectations of arrival. Then she failed to appear. Days passed, then weeks. Out on that wide blue emptiness, the absence itself began to harden into dread. When Joyita was finally found more than a month later, she seemed to have survived something her passengers had not. The vessel was damaged and taking on water, but still afloat, stubbornly buoyed by the very design that should have made her hard to lose. Her radio was set to the distress frequency, yet its range had been compromised. Bandages stained with blood lay among medical supplies. Some cargo was missing. So were the logbook, certain navigation tools, and the people. Not a single passenger or crew member remained to explain the sequence of fear. There are plausible readings of what happened. A leaking pipe, failing pumps, a listing hull in the dark, a captain forced to make decisions with incomplete information while the sea pressed in from every side. In such moments, people do not respond to engineering facts. They respond to what they believe the next 10 minutes might bring. Perhaps those aboard thought the ship was about to sink and took to boats too early. Perhaps injury, confusion, or panic moved faster than reason. Perhaps something else entered the story and vanished with them. That is what makes Joyita so haunting. The ship did not simply disappear. It returned in fragments, offering evidence without narrative, objects without voices. A vessel built to stay afloat became a floating reminder that survival is not only about structure, it is also about trust, judgment, and the fragile thread that holds a group of people together when the horizon stops offering comfort. Sometimes a mystery is not the absence of facts. It is the presence of just enough facts to reveal how quickly certainty can come apart. How do three people vanish from a modern yacht in fair weather, leaving behind the quiet evidence of an ordinary afternoon? In April 2007, a white catamaran called Kaz II was discovered drifting off the coast of Queensland, its engines still engaged, its sails partly raised, one of them torn by the wind. From a distance, the boat did not look abandoned. It looked paused. Inside, the scene deepened the unease. A laptop sat open, food had been set out, and personal belongings remained where their owners had last touched them. Then came the realization that made the case unforgettable. The vessel was intact, but the three men aboard were gone. They were experienced sailors on a familiar route. There had been no reported storm, no collision, no clear sign of violence. Life jackets were still stored away. The emergency beacon had not been activated. Wallets and phones had been left behind. The GPS later suggested the boat had wandered in loose circles for hours, perhaps days, with no one at the helm. It was not the image of disaster most people expect. It was stranger than that. It was order without presence. One possibility is painfully simple. A rope trailing from the stern may have caught in the water. Perhaps one man went overboard while adjusting equipment, and the others followed in a desperate attempt to save him. On a small vessel, compassion can become catastrophe in seconds. A single misstep can turn three competent adults into three separate emergencies. Yet even this explanation carries a quiet resistance. Why no distress call? Why no final signal? Why did the boat continue on as if human intention had been cut away all at once? That may be what unsettles us most about Kaz II. It belonged to an age of electronics, navigation software, and constant contact, an era that promised fewer blind spots. And still, the sea created one. Technology can measure position. It cannot always preserve a human moment when it breaks apart. What kind of storm leaves a ship behind like a sentence with its final words torn away? In the summer of 1881, a vessel named Ellen Austin was crossing the Atlantic when her crew spotted another schooner drifting alone. At first, it was a familiar maritime image: weathered sails, erratic movement, no answering signal. But as the Austin drew closer, the feeling changed. The abandoned schooner appeared seaworthy enough to salvage. Its cargo was still aboard. Its structure had not been reduced to wreckage, yet there was no one there to claim it, no living voice to explain how a functioning ship had been emptied in the middle of open water. What followed is where history begins to blur into maritime folklore. According to the most repeated version, a small boarding party from the Ellen Austin was sent to take control of the derelict vessel so both ships could sail together toward port. For a time they did, then fog or bad weather separated them. When the unknown schooner was seen again, the boarding party had vanished as completely as the original crew. Some retellings say the ship was found deserted a second time. Others say it was never recovered at all. The facts are difficult to pin down, and that uncertainty is part of the story's power. There may be practical reasons for the confusion. 19th century reporting was inconsistent. Newspapers embroidered events. Sailors' accounts were often filtered through retellings shaped by distance and imagination. It is possible that several incidents merged into one legend, polished over time by repetition. And yet, even with the exaggeration stripped away, something remains compelling. A vessel adrift, then perhaps reclaimed, then emptied again, as if the sea refused every attempt to make the story neat. The Ellen Austen endures because it sits at the edge of record and myth. It reminds us that history is not only made of facts preserved in order, it is also made of fragments, omissions, and narratives that grow in the spaces where certainty fails. Sometimes the mystery is not just what happened at sea, it is how human memory, like the ocean, reshapes whatever it cannot fully hold. What does a ship sound like when it has outlived the people who once gave it purpose? In 2003, Australian authorities encountered a rust-streaked fishing vessel drifting in the waters near the Torres Strait. It was a small craft, unremarkable at first glance, the kind of boat that might easily disappear into the broad traffic of regional seas. But when officials boarded it, they found no crew, no explanation, no clear sequence of events that could turn a working vessel into an empty shell. The name most often attached to the case was High Aim 6, though even its identity carried layers of uncertainty, as though the story itself had arrived half erased. The scene aboard was sparse and deeply unsettling. Food remained, equipment remained, signs of recent human presence lingered in the ordinary arrangement of life at sea, yet the people themselves had vanished. Not in a storm that announced itself, not in the aftermath of visible wreckage, but in the quiet interval between one moment of routine and the next. Investigators suspected the boat had likely come from Taiwanese waters and may have been involved in migrant transport or illicit fishing activity. That widened the field of possibility without bringing any real closure. A captain can disappear for many reasons. A crew can scatter in fear, desperation, or coercion. But the vessel kept none of their voices. In a case like this, the absence becomes political as well as personal. The sea does not separate mystery from circumstance. It carries poverty, labor, smuggling, weather, and human risk in the same current. Not every ghost ship is born from a single dramatic event. Some emerge from systems so strained and invisible that when something goes wrong, there is no reliable record to hold the truth in place. That may be the quiet lesson of High Aim 6. Behind every abandoned boat lies not only a puzzle, but a human world of pressure and compromise, often far from public view. The empty deck is haunting, yes, but what haunts it most may be the knowledge that some disappearances are not remembered because they were never fully seen in the first place. What kind of voyage leaves behind fine maps, fresh provisions, and the unmistakable impression that someone intended not to be understood? In August 2006, Italian authorities were alerted to a sleek sailing yacht drifting near Sardinia. It was elegant, well-supplied, and curiously untouched by the disorder one expects from a vessel in trouble. A meal had been started in the galley, navigation tools were arranged with care, clothing and expensive goods remained aboard. Yet when officials stepped onto the deck, they found no captain, no guests, no crew. Only the polished stillness of a boat that seemed to have been emptied with intention. The vessel became known as the Bel Amica, though even that name carried a haze of uncertainty. There was no clear registration, no standard paper trail, no reassuring chain of ownership that could settle the matter. Instead, there were fragments, a French flag, luxury items, notes that appeared to reference Mediterranean ports, and charts marked in ways that suggested movement beyond pleasure sailing. The yacht did not feel improvised. It felt curated, not abandoned in chaos, but left behind after a purpose had already been served. Eventually, a man came forward claiming ownership, offering a personal explanation for why the vessel had been left to drift, but the account never fully quieted the unease. Too many details seemed oddly shaped around secrecy. The boat had been provisioned for more than a casual outing. Its equipment hinted at discipline rather than leisure. And the absence of ordinary documentation only sharpened the central question. Who had truly been aboard, and what kind of journey had this been before it turned into a mystery? There are sensible possibilities, of course. Smuggling, tax evasion, illegal transport masked as private travel. The Mediterranean has always been more than postcard water. It is also a corridor of commerce, migration, and hidden exchange. A beautiful vessel can move through that world carrying stories no manifest will ever list. In that sense, the Bel Amica feels less like a ghost ship and more like a forgotten sentence from a larger, unseen narrative. And perhaps that is what lingers. Not every maritime mystery is born from disaster. Some are shaped by discretion, by the human desire to move without being known. The sea keeps those intentions better than land ever could. On shore, names accumulate. Records harden. People ask questions. But on open water, identity can thin into rumor. A boat can drift into view carrying all the signs of wealth and planning and still reveal almost nothing about the lives that pass through it. What disappears is not only the crew. It is motive, context, and the fragile truth that every journey leaves behind. What do we make of a vessel that arrives looking less like evidence and more like a warning no one can decode? In January 2014, a small life raft was found washed ashore on one of the Marshall Islands. Inside were human remains, weathered by sun, salt, and time. At first, the discovery seemed unbearably narrow. One raft, one tragedy, one unknown dead. But as investigators studied currents, debris, and the boat's likely path, the story widened into something more unsettling. The raft appeared to be tied to a fishing vessel or small craft that had drifted for an immense distance across the Pacific, carrying its final witness in silence. In popular retellings, the image became almost unbearable in its simplicity. A man alone at sea, supplies dwindling, the horizon repeating itself until time lost its shape. Whether the raft had broken away from a larger boat or was all that remained of one, it pointed toward a human ordeal defined not by spectacle, but by duration. The Pacific does not need violence to overwhelm a person. Its scale is enough. A drifting craft can become a world unto itself, with no clocks but daylight and no measure but endurance. What haunted investigators was not merely the death, but the absence of a clean narrative. There was no surviving companion, no radio exchange complete enough to reconstruct the final days, no logbook to convert suffering into sequence. There were only scattered signs in the patient mathematics of ocean currents. Science could suggest routes, weather patterns, and probabilities. It could narrow the field, but it could not restore the interior life of the person who had been there, watching sky and water trade places for week after week. This kind of maritime mystery is quieter than a ghost ship found under sail, yet it touches the same nerve. The sea returns fragments, not explanations. It offers enough to prove that a life was carried into isolation, but not enough to tell us how hope rose and fell inside that confinement. In the end, what remains is not just a forensic puzzle, it is a deeply human confrontation with scale. Because one of the hardest truths the ocean teaches is this: a person can leave the known world by accident and still remain heartbreakingly close to us in imagination. We picture the thirst, the stubbornness, the memories that must have come and gone like weather. And in doing so, we recognize something fragile in ourselves. Not only our vulnerability, but our need to turn even the loneliest ending into a form of witness. Can a vessel become mysterious simply because no one was ever meant to find it? In the waters off northern Australia and across the broader reaches of Southeast Asia, authorities have occasionally encountered abandoned fishing boats that seem to drift out of another reality. They were weathered, underpowered, and often anonymous at first glance, with peeling paint and improvised repairs speaking of hard labor rather than legend. Yet once boarded, they revealed the same unsettling pattern that marks so many maritime enigmas: supplies left behind, equipment still in place, and no one aboard to explain the last decision that turned motion into abandonment. Some of these boats were eventually tied to illegal fishing networks, migrant routes, or unregulated labor operations that moved through the sea's blind spots. That context matters. It changes the tone of the mystery. Instead of suggesting a single dramatic event, it points toward a world in which disappearance can grow from exploitation, fear of interception, mechanical failure, or a rushed transfer at sea. In these cases, emptiness is not always an accident of weather. Sometimes it is the residue of systems built to leave as little trace as possible. And yet the human effect is no less haunting. An empty vessel still carries the atmosphere of interruption. A half-used fuel can, a tangle of nets, a sleeping mat rolled in the corner, a pot left blackened by flame. These are not just objects. They are the quiet grammar of people trying to endure difficult work far from the gaze of law or comfort. When the people vanish and the boat remains, The scene feels both intimate and withheld. It hints at exhaustion, urgency, and decisions made under pressure, but it does not let us hear the voices. That may be the hidden theme beneath many lesser-known ghost ships. They are not famous because they are unsolvable in some grand, theatrical way. They are memorable because they reveal how much of the ocean's human traffic still passes through shadow. Commerce, survival, migration, and risk all move across the same water, and not every missing crew becomes a headline. Some are absorbed into statistics or never properly counted at all. So the mystery changes shape. It is no longer only about what happened on one boat in one lost hour. It becomes a question about what kinds of lives can disappear with so little record. The sea does not create that invisibility by itself. It inherits it from us. And when an abandoned vessel drifts into view, it sometimes exposes not just a missing crew, but a missing attention we should have paid long before the deck fell silent. What happens when the loneliest ocean on Earth stops being a place and becomes a mirror? In 1969, during the Sunday Times Golden Globe race, a trimaran named Teignmouth Electron drifted alone in the Atlantic, her voyage unfinished, her purpose suddenly stripped of its human center. She had belonged to Donald Crowhurst, an amateur sailor and inventor who entered the race carrying more ambition than preparation, and perhaps more pressure than any one person could safely absorb. The race was meant to celebrate endurance and brilliance. Instead, it became one of the most intimate maritime tragedies ever recovered from open water. When the yacht was found, Crowhurst was gone. No body, no final witness. But unlike so many ghost ships, Teignmouth Electron did not keep complete silence. On board were logs, notes, and pages of private writing that revealed a mind under extraordinary strain. Crowhurst had fallen behind early, faced severe equipment problems, and seems to have understood that finishing the race honestly might be impossible. So he began sending false positions, constructing the illusion of progress while drifting in isolation, suspended between public expectation and private collapse. Those recovered journals are haunting because they shift the mystery inward. Here, the missing crew was one man, and the vessel did not merely suggest danger from outside. It reflected danger from within. As the weeks passed, his entries moved between calculation, confession, philosophical fragments, and signs of psychological disintegration. The ocean had not simply threatened his body, it had dismantled his bearings, moral and mental alike. At some point, he disappeared overboard, whether by accident, despair, or deliberate choice, no one can say with certainty. Teignmouth Electron reminds us that the sea does not only test seamanship, it tests identity. Alone for long enough, beneath a horizon that never answers back, a person can lose the stable edges of self. Crowhurst's story is not one of monsters, sabotage, or theft. It is in some ways more unsettling than that. It is a story about pressure, performance, shame, and the unbearable distance between who we are and who we feel required to be. That may be why his abandoned yacht still lingers in the imagination. Not as a puzzle of mechanics, but as a record of what solitude can do when no one is there to interrupt it. Some ships are emptied by weather, some by fear, and some by the slow, invisible fracture of a human mind trying to stay afloat in more ways than one. What if the sea's greatest mystery is not disappearance itself, but the way one vanished life can echo through generations of questions? In 1947, a Dutch vessel called the Unexplained entered maritime lore through one of the strangest distress stories ever repeated. According to the account, nearby ships received a chilling radio message. All officers, perhaps the entire crew, were dead, lying where they had fallen. Then came one final sentence, often quoted with a kind of horrified reverence. The sender seemed to suggest that death was coming for him too. When rescuers reportedly boarded the ship, they found bodies frozen in expressions of terror, eyes open, arms raised, as if they had seen something just beyond language. Then, the story says, the ship exploded and sank before it could be fully examined. It is a remarkable tale. It is also one of the most disputed in maritime history. Unlike cases grounded in clear logs, insurance records, and official investigations, the story of the Unexplained arrives through retellings, scattered articles, and conflicting details. Researchers have long questioned whether the ship existed in the documented form later legend claimed. Some suggest the vessel may have been carrying dangerous chemicals that release toxic fumes. Others suspect a wartime or smuggling connection, or a simple fusion of rumor and post-war anxiety. And many believe the account was embellished so heavily that it no longer rests on any single recoverable event. The deeper one looks, the less solid the ship becomes. Yet even doubtful stories endure for a reason. The Urong Medan speaks to a human fear older than radio and steel hulls. The fear of encountering a scene that seems to preserve terror without preserving explanation. A ship full of dead men is terrible enough. A ship that may never have existed in quite the way we imagine becomes something else altogether. It turns from incident into parable. Maybe that is the real significance of the story. It reminds us that mystery lives not only in what happened, but in what people choose to remember and repeat. We do not pass down these tales because they solve the sea. We pass them down because they give shape to our unease before the unknown. Some ships drift through history on currents of fact. Others travel by rumor, but both reveal the same longing beneath them. To look into darkness, name what frightened us, and believe for a moment that naming it brings us closer to understanding. How does an empty ship keep speaking long after the water has finished moving it? By the time we reach the later cases in this journey, a pattern begins to emerge, not in the details, but in the emotional architecture. Again and again, the sea returns the object without the story. It gives us wood, steel, rope, canvas, radio equipment, charts, cooking utensils, clothing, and weathered decks. It gives us the shell of intention. But the living thread that could bind those things into meaning is gone. What remains is not just evidence. It is an unfinished sentence. That is why abandoned vessels occupy such a distinct place in the imagination. A wreck makes one kind of sense. It tells us that force prevailed. But a drifting ship, upright and quiet, asks for a different kind of attention. It invites interpretation. It tempts projection. We begin filling the silence with the fears most familiar to us: panic, mutiny, accident, deception, illness, weather, human error, despair. Sometimes one of these explanations is likely correct. Sometimes several may be true at once. But even the most rational answer does not erase the feeling that something essential has slipped past the frame. And perhaps that feeling tells us as much about ourselves as it does about the ships. We are creatures who build narratives in order to live with uncertainty. We want beginnings that lead cleanly to endings. We want causes proportionate to consequences. Yet the sea has never respected that desire. It is too large, too fluid, too skilled at breaking sequence. A person can make one prudent decision and still be lost. Another can make a reckless one and survive. Entire crews can vanish into conditions no satellite, no tribunal, no archive can fully reconstruct. The ocean preserves movement, not meaning. So these mysteries persist not because they reject reason, but because they reveal reason's boundary. Investigation matters. Evidence matters. Skepticism matters. But there comes a point when all honest inquiry must admit the same thing. Some stories cannot be recovered in full, not because they are supernatural, and not because truth does not exist, but because truth sometimes disappears with the last witness. In that silence, the ship continues on without us. And in watching it drift, we are asked one of the oldest human questions of all: how do we honor what we cannot completely know? What if every ghost ship is, in the end, a lesson about the unfinished nature of being human? Stand on any shoreline long enough and you begin to understand why these stories endure. The horizon promises direction, but it withholds detail. It invites departure while concealing consequence. For centuries, ships have carried more than cargo across that line. They have carried hope, debt, ambition, exile, duty, love, and the quiet desire to return changed but intact. When one of those ships comes back empty, the mystery is not only nautical, it is personal. Something about the human plan has been interrupted, and all that remains is the vessel that once believed in arrival. Across these cases, the differences matter. Some were likely shaped by weather and error, some by fear, some by secrecy, exploitation, or private despair. Some may have been altered by rumor until history and legend could no longer be neatly separated. Yet all of them leave behind the same essential image: a structure designed for passage still moving through the world after its people have slipped out of reach. That image touches something deep because it resembles so many other forms of loss. A room left as it was, a voice preserved in writing, a life inferred through objects after the life itself is gone. This is why the sea has always been more than geography in the human imagination. It is a place where knowledge and humility meet. We chart it, cross it, forecast it, and study it with increasingly precise tools. And still, it reminds us that data is not the same as presence. We may know where a ship drifted, how the currents moved, what the weather likely did, what mechanical failures are plausible. But such knowledge, however valuable, does not always restore the final human texture of events. It cannot tell us exactly what someone feared, hoped, misunderstood, or chose in the decisive moment. Maybe that is the wisdom hidden inside these abandoned vessels. They ask us to resist two temptations at once: the temptation to turn every mystery into fantasy, and the temptation to believe every mystery must yield completely to explanation. Between those extremes lies a more difficult posture, one that history often requires of us: attention, patience, respect for evidence, and respect for silence. The empty ship drifts on, and what it leaves with us is not just uncertainty, but a more tender understanding of how fragile every passage really is. So what do these silent ships finally leave us with? Not certainty, not closure, and perhaps not even the comfort of a final lesson. What they leave us with is something more durable than answers, a way of thinking about human life in relation to distance, risk, memory, and the unknown. Each vessel in this journey began as an act of intention. Someone studied a map, someone checked the weather, someone packed food, tied lines, trusted an engine, signed a paper, kissed a loved one goodbye, and believed in a destination. The mystery enters only later, when that intention breaks apart, and the ship continues on without the people who gave it meaning. That is why these stories endure beyond maritime history. They speak to a wider truth about being human. We build routes through uncertainty every day. We make plans with incomplete knowledge. We move forward on faith, skill, habit, and hope. Most of the time, that is enough. But now and then, whether at sea or on land, life reminds us that control was always partial, that every journey contains variables beyond our sight. In that sense, the abandoned ship is not only an object of curiosity, it is a mirror held up to our own fragile confidence. And yet there is something quietly beautiful in the way we continue to ask about these disappearances. We investigate them, we preserve the records, we compare testimonies, question legends, test practical explanations, and refuse to let the missing vanish a second time into indifference. That effort matters. It is a form of care. Even when truth remains incomplete, the search itself becomes an ethical act, a way of honoring lives interrupted beyond the edge of witness. Perhaps that is the final meaning of these ghost ships. They remind us that mystery is not failure. Sometimes it is the natural shape of reality, where evidence runs out and human longing continues. To live wisely is not to solve every darkness, but to meet it with humility, discipline, and imagination. Out on the water, the last light fades and the horizon becomes a single unbroken line. Somewhere in that widening dusk, history and silence still travel together. And we, watching from shore, are left with the same enduring question that has always followed the sea: how much of any life can truly be known, and how much must be carried forward as wonder?